on Russia-U.S. relations vis-a-vis this specific incident. We are joined here in Beijing, Xiyu, Senior Research Fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Joining us in Moscow, in Russia, Pavel Felgenhauer, Russian defense analyst. And in Washington, D.C., the United States, we invited Ivan Eland, a senior fellow and director of the Center for Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. I want to welcome the three of you. Mr. Eland, may I have you and your Russian colleagues' attention? Help us to understand step by step, how did we, from the very beginning of the Trump administration's apparent trying to engage with Russia to where we are now? It didn't take us very long time to see this very different approach, Mr. Eland.
Well, of course, I think Trump still would like to have a better relationship with Russia. However, I think there are issues that Russia and the United States have that are they're on opposite sides in Ukraine, they're on opposite sides in Syria, and they're sort of on opposite sides with Iran as well, because Russia and Iran have formed at least a alliance of the just basically an advantageous temporary alliance in the Syrian conflict as well. So, and the United States has an adversarial policy with Iran. So these issues are still there, and they're not going away.
Right. What about that? I mean, how would you make of Russia's response to this specific incident as being mentioned? I want to go to you, Mr. Felgenhauer. Exactly what Russia meant. Russia responded to the incident with a warning that all aircraft of the U.S.-led international coalition in certain areas will be tracked and treated as targets. But Moscow fell short of openly declaring they would shoot down coalition planes. So what exactly is Russia trying to indicate here, Mr. Felgenhauer?
Well, Moscow is very angry over this incident. Russia has invested in the last couple of years a lot of effort and treasure into revigorating the Syrian government army air force. So we kind of trained these guys, we modernized their planes, put them back into action, and each lost plane is always a serious blow to the Russian overall strategy, as President Vladimir Putin recently said, that we want to withdraw our forces to our two bases in Syria, Tartus and Khmeimim, and for the Syrian army to fight their battles, mostly on their own, a kind of Syriization program. And but the Syrian army depends on their support, and if that is under question, that's serious. So Russia is sending a serious kind of signal, but no one wants to fight the Americans. The Russian military, under no circumstances, want to go against the Americans in open battle, and the same, I'm sure, the American military don't want to fight the Russians.
Mr. Eland, what is this about? Is this about Syria and who wants to have an upper hand in Syria, whether it is so-called coalition, mainly U.S., or it is Russia? Or is it about the other way, which is a competition between the two countries, United States and Russia, in some of the hotspot areas of the world, and eventually to see who will be, having an upper hand?
Well, I think there's still some competition between Russia and the U.S. that was never buried during the Cold War. And I think this is sort of a ridiculous competition, since Syria is not really strategic to the United States. Syria has been an ally of Russia, and I understand why Russia is in there. But if the United States really wanted to, we could give the Russians a quagmire there, because I don't think Assad is going to retake all portions of Syria, and there's going to be fighting in Syria for a long time. So from my perspective, all the U.S. enemies are fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda on one side, and then you have the Hezbollah, the Iranian militias, the Syrian government, and the Russians on the other side. So if your adversaries are fighting, it might be, Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, would have said, step back and let them have at it, let them fight. But the U.S. has committed to take out ISIS. The question is, what's next? If ISIS is defeated in Mosul and Raqqa, then do we go after? Some in the Trump administration are saying, despite his campaign pledges to the contrary, that they might want to challenge the Iranian militias. And I think that's a bad escalation. Okay. I don't think we want to get involved any deeper in this conflict myself.
Mr. Felgenhauer, what does Russia feel about this? I mean, to see, on the one hand, the U.S. is in a way quite disconnected with the direction of where things are going in Syria. On the other hand, you see this very strong internal debate in U.S. politics of what to do with Syria. What does Russia make of this very interesting phenomenon on both issues?
Well, the biggest problem right now in Moscow, we don't understand what's the American strategy. Which voice in Washington is really the voice of authority? Of course, well, yes, there's President Donald Trump. He's the voice of authority, but it's, from his tweets, it's hard to figure, again, what's the American strategy. So that's what Russian president and Russian officials are saying, that we are just simply frustrated because we don't know what the Americans want. We don't understand what they'll do next. Why they dig in their heels defending special places in Syria in the south and near Raqqa, use their forces to attack Assad's forces, and then say we don't want to defeat Assad, but we're defending ourselves, but not ourselves, but our allies. And why one point they defend, the other they don't. Moscow would very much, and Kremlin would want to figure that out, hoping maybe a summit next month with Trump will give at least some clarity, because right now it's all fog of war.
Well, Mr. Yang here in Beijing, of course you're observing this from afar, but you see that interesting thing. On the one hand, the internal debate and confusing picture from Washington about what to do with Syria could give Russia an upper hand strategically on the issue. Yep. But also, you also heard from Mr. Felgenhauer about Russia's confusion as to take a strategic reaction to what Washington might be having in mind, and its point is confusing. So what do you think about these two mixed pictures? What would that mean, do you think, for Russia in a way, and its strategic position in Syria?
Well, I need to explain this situation in the bigger background. Say, neither Ukraine nor Syria is vital for the United States. And for Russia, Ukraine, to some degree, is vital. So I don't believe Russia will make any concession in Ukraine issue with US and the EU, no matter how huge pressures will be on the Russia. But on Syria, I believe neither Russia nor US regard that country as a vital area for their so-called national interests. But why the two big powers have no any signal to make a concession to the opposite, escalating the tensions? Our Russian colleagues say Russia is confused, but I do feel that U.S. has no strategy on Syria at all. They have a very obvious enemy, say IS. And they also have a very important, so-called important target, say, removing the Assad regime. But the key question is, what if Assad regime is removed? It would be better or worse?
Right.
I'm afraid say, yeah. So not only no strategy, but also it seems to me, frankly, reckless. Say even without calculation, what's next?
Right.
What's next after remove the Assad regime?
And as a result of that, if I understand right, Mr. Eland, it is not anymore the priority target of the United States to remove the Assad regime, particularly given the complex geopolitics pictures over there and the priority that the U.S. have right now. What exactly does the United States want from Syria or from the issue of Syria? What exactly is the position that U.S. wants to pose to the rest of the world about that specific issue? And is the U.S. getting closer to that pose or getting either farther away from that pose?
Well, I think the strategy is unclear. This new administration has been in there 5 months, and I don't think they've had other things to worry about given the turmoil here over the Russian role in the election and other things. And so they haven't really clearly formulated a policy yet, and I think that's very dangerous because, as we've seen in the last few days, you know, the powers can get dragged into this. But I think I would say this thing could be settled with a partition of Syria, maybe a partition of Iraq, because Assad, the Russians could have Assad still in power, ruling his section on the spine near the Mediterranean, and you could have Sunni areas. And this would also, if you had the Sunnis were allowed to rule themselves rather than having Assad oppress them all the time, then you would also have evaporation of support for Al-Qaeda and ISIS, because the Sunnis, the support that the Sunnis get is because they fear the Assad regime and retaliation, and and that sort of thing. So I think the end game is a partition if you could ever get there.
If, Mr. Felgenhauer, Washington has lost interest in Syria, is it going to be still that important, geopolitically speaking, for Russia anymore? Mr. Felgenhauer.
Well, it's not clear that they really lost because their interest. It's not so clear because actually right now American presence on boots on the ground in Syria are dramatically increasing. There are more and more Americans involved in the fighting. They're bringing in new weapons, new troops in the south and in around Raqqa. So actually they're more involved than less. It's not clear. I mean, what happens afterwards, again, no one really understands. For Russia right now, for the present Russian regime, for the Kremlin, for the Russian military leaders who actually led Russia into Syria, it is important. It's if we withdraw from Syria and this whole adventure is going to be written down in history as a mistake, those who are right now in charge of the Russian general staff and military will be those who will take the blame. So they, of course, want to stay and want to prove that this was a wise decision, that Russia needs Syria.
So,
though there's a lot
Mr. Felgenhauer, if I could jump in here and try to clarify what you have just said. You are suggesting, in a way, to me, that there is a confusion, but at the same time, it could be a very mixed picture, that on the one hand, the U.S. apparently quite confused, do not have a overall quite well-planned strategy, but on the other hand, in reality, ever more presence in Syria. So to Russia, is that going to be more dangerous because it seems that the U.S. is having confusing policy, and yet, in reality, it is getting ever stronger over there. So what does that mean for Russia? Are you going to match it up?
Well, Russia has, Russia has, of course, limited financial, material, and military resources. The United States is much, much more stronger. If they pour in more resources into Syria, that will be a just serious problem for the Russians on the ground in our goal to kind of help Assad win the civil war.
Right.
And so that's, of course, could lead to more clashes and more confrontation, at least by proxy, between Russia and the United States.
Let me go to Mr. Eland to comment also about that. The apparent ever stronger presence on the ground in reality, comparing to so-called confusion to the others about the strategy.
Yes, well, I think the strategy is confused, and I think we have the same situation. The Trump administration is putting more troops into Afghanistan, and they don't really have a strategy to defeat the Taliban or even get a negotiated settlement there. And I don't think they don't know what their objective is in Syria. Some people in the Trump administration, as I mentioned before, want to go after the Iranian militia, and of course that opens a whole another can of worms. Right now, they're supposed to, the U.S. forces and the increased U.S. forces are supposed to be trying to combat ISIS, but eventually they're going to get that done because the pressure on ISIS is overwhelming, and I think that will be done one way or the other. But then the question is, you know, these things take on lives of their own. Okay, we have troops there, now let's do something else. So, but
we're going to see what the something else is.
We don't know.
Yes, that's true. Mr. Yang,
Right, we don't know.
Here's the thing. You got Russia and also the United States concentrating in Syria, but at the same time, you see some interesting development from the Trump administration, Mr. Yang. There was a visit to Saudi Arabia, and after that visit, there has been some apparent gestures coming from Saudi Arabia and Gulf region countries, seem to suggesting the messages they got from Washington is that Washington will let them go in terms of what they want to do with Iran, in terms of what they want to do to Qatar. So what about that? And how is this message in Syria also likely to be taken by the others when you think about all the other messages the Gulf region have already got, particularly when you think about, Mr. Yang, I want to ask you the big picture, the Middle East as a whole.
Yeah. Let me put it this way. Actually, the political division has been made by the local religious groups led by Saudi Arabia as one side and Iran, Syria on the other side. And the U.S. has been deepening their involvement by supporting one of the groups, say Saudi Arabia. So we have seen a rapid development of the bilateral relation with U.S. and Saudi Arabia, and meanwhile the worse and worse relation with Iran and Syria. So that is, if U.S. has no strategy, clear strategy, but they have got a clear policy direction, say pro-Saudi Arabia and anti the other groups. So such a cleared policy direction make the things worse in this region, say make the division deepen and make the contradictions between the outside players like U.S. and Russia in a more complicated shape of relationship.
As a result of that, Mr. Felgenhauer, from Russia's strategic perspective, do you think it is also smart for Russia to take sides, for example, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran, somebody else?
Well, actually, right now, Russia is trying to play wise in the Middle East, at least in that respect, and trying to spread its allegiances and alliances outside of the Shia kind of corner in which we found ourselves, and try to establish better relations with Sunni nations, with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt, possibly with Turkey, and actually in the Qatar-Saudi Arabia row, Russia is taking the middle ground and trying maybe to be a bit of a kind of go-between. So Russia is trying to be good with everyone, and of course at the same time with Iran and with Israel, and building up kind of complicated relations and trying to have more possible Sunni proxies even in Syria to broaden our base, so that with not very big investment of forces and capital, we could have a sizable influence in the Middle East, maybe eclipsing even the United States. That's the kind of wish, dream that we see right now from Moscow.
Pavel Felgenhauer, Ivan Eland, Yang Xiyu, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Thank you.